welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Katie, otherwise known as the Vintage Academic. I'm a transfer student at UC Berkeley. I'm currently a senior. I just finished up my first semester as a senior, so that's very exciting. I study anthropology and archaeology, and in today's video, I want to talk a little bit about how I take notes as a student at UC Berkeley. So normally when I sit down to write a scripted video like this one, I actually do research on other people's videos that they've made on similar subjects. But when I was researching for this video, one of the things that I noticed is that my note-taking system is so much different than other people's note-taking systems. I think I utilize a lot of the common methods that people know for taking notes. The thing about it is that I have ADHD. ADHD, or Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, is a neurodevelopmental disorder that heavily impacts what we call executive functioning skills. Executive function is like a set of mental skills that include things like a working memory, planning, time management, organization, flexible thinking, essentially all the things that make you successful at being a student. So because I have ADHD and because I have a hard time with things like time management, planning, and organization, taking notes can be really overwhelming for me. Taking notes for people with ADHD can be really overwhelming because while other people might see taking notes as just one task, ADHD brains are really good at taking one task and breaking it down into all of its components and then feeling super overwhelmed by the fact that we have to take all of those steps in order to complete the task. We have to first pay attention, which is hard enough already because it's literally called attention deficit disorder. We have to process what the professor is saying. We have to decide what's important and what to write down. We have to hold on to it long enough in order to actually write it down in a way that we'll be able to understand later when we go back to look at our notes, and do all of this while the professor is still talking. So an average person who doesn't have ADHD, sitting in lecture taking notes might look like hearing what the professor says, remembering it long enough to write it down, and then remembering to come back to your notes later during revision or review. But taking notes with ADHD looks more like, wow, my working memory is really struggling today, my distractibility is high, I am paying attention to everything but what the professor is saying, I'm only kind of half hearing the words that are coming out of my professor's mouth, I'm having a hard time deciding what to write down and what not to write down, and I forget what I was writing down halfway through the sentence. Then once class is wrapped up and I've gone home, I've forgotten I've even taken notes. Sounds pretty frustrating, right? Another really important thing that I think you should know for the sake of this video is that ADHD brains are famously inconsistent. It's about the only thing we're consistent at doing. This means that note-taking systems don't always work for me. So while other study tubers might have this beautifully organized note-taking system, after developing a system, sometimes it stops working for me. And that's the reason why I wanted to make this video. Like I said, other study tubers out there, their systems might change over time as they work on and develop their study skills. But for me, sometimes my systems can change on a daily basis. Learning to live with and, well, learn with ADHD is all about allowing yourself to be flexible and use whatever system or method is working for you right now in this moment. One of the other things about ADHD brains is that we love novelty and newness, so sometimes switching things up is what gets us to actually pay attention and absorb the information. However, it can be frustrating because sometimes it's hard to figure out what system is actually working for you on that day. But I have developed a couple of different systems, methods, components that have made learning and taking notes with ADHD just a little bit easier. However, before we actually get into them, I need to disclaim something. I do not do these things perfectly. I do not take notes the same way every time I go to lecture. Sometimes I'm great at writing notes, and sometimes I don't even write notes at all. It kind of depends on where my brain is at that day, and I've had to learn to be okay with that. So now that that long intro is out of the way, let's actually get into the systems that I have developed and use on kind of an alternating basis. The first way that I take notes is something that I call scratch notes. Scratch notes is a system where you take whatever note-taking supplies you have. I personally use an iPad Pro 11 and just write down any and all information from the lecture that you found important, useful, or helpful to remembering what the lecture was about. This can be words, numbers, drawings, pictures, whatever it is that you find useful. After lecture is over, either right after class or usually I wait until the evening, I take out my scratch notes and any other supplemental materials such as the lecture slides, textbooks, whatever article we're reading, and I rewrite the lecture in my own words from the notes that I took. By rewriting the lecture in your own words, you're making sure that you're actually processing and understanding the material. It's what one of my professors here at Berkeley like to call synthesizing your own knowledge/understanding. If you can take something that somebody else has told you and reiterate it in your own words, that's a pretty good indicator that you actually learned something, you can wrap your brain around it, you understand it, and you'll be able to recall it from your long-term memory memory for something like an exam or a paper. I also think that this system is really great for setting yourself up for future success because it essentially creates a study guide for you throughout the semester. So rather than receiving a study guide from your professor a week before the exam and spending that 1 week cramming all of your studying into that study guide, you already have one that you've been developing, that you've been revisiting and revising throughout the semester. Now, I should say that this is the system that I used the most back when I was in community college, and my course evaluations depended more on exams than papers like they do now that I'm at Berkeley. So I find this one to be really useful for memorization for exams, and I think kind of anything that'd be in a lower division course where you're really building that foundational knowledge and you need to memorize certain terms, keywords, and concepts that you're going to build on later in upper division courses. So now that I am at Berkeley and now that I am in upper division courses, let's take a look at some of the other systems that I use now. Before I get into this next section, I should say that the next two techniques are going to require some kind of technology, whether it's your phone's voice recorder, your iPad's recorder, a separate voice recorder device, anything that you can use to record audio. This is because as somebody with ADHD, it takes me longer to process auditory information than other people. So I use my iPad's recording abilities in conjunction with the note-taking app Notability because I can record the lecture as the professor is giving it, and it tracks where you're writing at any given point in time of the audio recording, if that makes sense. So it records the audio and connects it to what you're writing. Really, the only difference between this and the sketch note-taking method is the audio recording, if I'm being completely honest. In community college, I found it a lot easier to keep up with the lectures, what the professor was saying, meaning that I had an easier time keeping up with my note-taking. But something about upper division coursework just makes it a little bit harder for me to process that information quickly. So I record my lectures so that during the revision process, I can go back and listen to the audio recording and fill in my notes in any places that I was clearly not keeping up. Also, a side note, I handwrite all of my notes. I do this because I do not retain anything if I type them, and there's also something about handwriting my notes that makes it have like a physicality to it that typed documents don't have for me. So writing things out by hand forms stronger connections in my brain. So that's one of the reasons why I love having an iPad and an Apple Pencil, because I can handwrite my notes, but they are still digital, meaning I can access my notes from any platform, and handwritten notes on things like Notability and GoodNotes are actually searchable. It's a great option for people who love handwriting their notes but also want the perks of technology, and I think it's great for ADHD people. Anyways, back to what I was saying. I also find using audio recordings really helpful for staying present during lecture. It helps me pay attention to lecture better because it means I'm not worrying about what I'm writing down, what I'm missing out on, and trying to make a decision about what information I think is important and what's not to put into my notes. The audio recording is capturing all of that for me so I can review it later on down the road and kind of takes the pressure off, I guess is what I'm saying. Another reason why I think taking notes on an iPad with the perks of technology is really important for somebody with ADHD is because you can do things like add photos, add drawings, add colors, make them aesthetically pleasing and engaging to use. The only drawback that I think that there is to having an iPad for notes for ADHD people is the fact that it gives you access to social media apps and games and things like that that can distract you during lecture, but Apple products do now have like the focus mode where you can actually turn off notifications, take away access to certain apps and things like that. So overall, a great option for people with ADHD, and this is not sponsored, I just really love my iPad. Anyways, let's move on to the last of the three methods that I have been using here at Berkeley. So the last technique that I use is when I can tell that there's going to be way too much information in the lecture for me to keep up. When this is the case, I actually download the lecture slides and I import them into Notability so that I can follow along with the lecture slides as the professor is giving the lecture. I can annotate the slides in order to add my own thoughts and connections, and I can also record the audio of the lecture so I can go back and fill in any missing pieces of information. I think I really tend more towards this method closer to the end of the semester when we're winding down, my brain is full of information from the entire semester, and I'm channeling much more of my brain power towards surviving the semester and final projects and papers and things like that. So while I'm not sure it's the most effective method for note-taking in terms of like actually absorbing the information and making your own connections, or like that deep memory formation, deep learning, I do think it's a good solution for when your brain is tired and you still need some way of taking notes that are going to be helpful later on in research papers and exams. So now I think that just about wraps up the three different note-taking methods that I have utilized since becoming a college student. I'm sure that these methods are going to change or I'll adopt new ones as I go on into things like grad school, but they are what works for me in this moment in time. And I really want to reiterate to anybody watching this video that these are not perfect and consistent systems. I switch between the three depending on what class I'm in, whether it's a lecture or a seminar, how much information is going to be in the lecture, how I'm feeling that day, whether or not I think I'm capable of keeping up with lecture, and sometimes I simply just don't take notes. I also don't always go back and revise my notes, like I said. I have tons of halfway finished or halfway revised notes because, at least for my ADHD brain, if I don't have a really good reason to go back and revisit my notes, I simply won't do it. I think it was easier for me to go back and actually revise my notes, rewrite them in my own words in community college when my final grade depended on my ability to memorize certain information from my notes. But now that my coursework requires me to do things more like writing papers or final projects, the memorization aspect isn't so important, and I can typically rely on the original notes that I took in lecture as well as the annotations that I make while I'm reading. Which, by the way, if you want to learn more about how I read in college, especially as somebody with ADHD, go ahead and check the link below because I made a video about that just the other day. So basically, I guess what I'm trying to say is that if you and your study systems don't look perfect and aesthetic and consistent like others in the StudyTube community might, it's okay. It's more important that you have a system that works for you, that you're engaging with your academics in a deep and meaningful way, and that you're getting out of your education what you want and need to get out of your education for your goals and purposes in life. So I think that is essentially all that I had to say on this matter. Just remember, note-taking systems, they should work for you and not for the aesthetic social media posts. As always, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up, leave me a comment, tell me what kind of note-taking system do you use, and maybe should I try switching mine up a little bit? Don't forget to subscribe for more Anthropology, UC Berkeley, vintage related content, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye!